Good day, everyone. The topic that I will be presenting is about the Six Dynasties Period. Six Dynasties Period. Political developments. The division of China. Sangguo. Three Kingdoms. 220 to 280 BCE. In the north, all authority had passed in the hands of the Generalissimo and protector of the dynasty, Cao Cao. In 220 CE, the last puppet emperor of the Han officially ceded the throne to Cao Cao's son, who thereby became the legitimate heir of the empire and the first ruler of the Wei dynasty. Soon afterward, two competing military leaders proclaimed themselves emperor, one in the far interior Shu Han dynasty and one in the south behind the formidable barrier of the Yangtze River. The short and turbulent period of these three kingdoms, Sangguo, filled with bloody warfare and diplomatic intrigue, has ever since been glorified in the Chinese historical fiction as an age of chivalry and individual heroism. By the end of the 2nd century CE, the Han Empire had virtually ceased to exist. The repression of Taoist rebellions of the Yellow Turbans and related sects marked the beginning of a period of unbridled warlordism and political chaos from which three independent centuries of political power emerged: Wei Dynasty, Shu Han Dynasty, and Wu. Wei conquered Shu Han in 263 CE. 2 years later, a general of the dominant Sima clan overthrew the House of Wei 265 CE and founded the first of two dynasties under the name Jin, the Sea Western Jin. Wu, however, was able to maintain itself until 280 when it was overrun by the Jin armies. Wu marked the beginning of the progressive Sinicization of the region south of the Yangtze River, which before that time had been a frontier area inhabited mainly by non-Chinese tribal peoples. The rise of Zhenye, renamed Jiankang during Jin times, paved the way for future developments after the north was lost to barbarian invaders 311 CE. The Sea or Western Jin 265 to 316 or 317 CE. The empire had been nominally reunited 280 CE, and for a short time the central government attempted important fiscal and political reforms, mainly intended to curb the great families that threatened the ruler's authority. Contacts with the oasis kingdoms of Central Asia and the Indianized state of the far south, Funan and Champa, were resumed, and in 285 the Jin court even sent an envoy to distant Fergana in Central Asia to confer the title of king on its ruler. Within 2 decades, the Jin disintegrated through the struggles of rival clans. The era of barbarian invasions and rule. In 304 CE, a Sinicized Xiongnu chieftain Liu Yuan assumed the title of King of Han and started the conquest of northern China. Operating from bases in western and southern Shanxi, the Xiongnu armies, supported by local Chinese rebels, conquered the ancient homeland of Chinese civilization. The fall and destruction of the two capitals, Luoyang 311 CE and Chang'an 316 CE, thus in the north for centuries, ended Chinese dynastic rule. The whole North China plain itself became the scene of a bewildering variety of barbarian states called Shiluguo or 16 Kingdoms. The Dong or Eastern Jin 317 to 420, and later dynasties in the south 420 to 589. The former territory of Wu remained the stronghold of a series of legitimate Chinese dynasties with Jiangkan as their capital. From the beginning, the Jin court was completely at the mercy of the great landowning families. Government became a kind of oligarchy. The so-called Six Dynasties were politically and militarily weak and constantly plagued by internal feuds and revolts, were characterized by cultural brilliance. The term 16 Kingdoms traditionally denotes the plethora of short-lived non-Chinese dynasties that from 303 came to rule the whole or parts of northern China. Many ethnic groups were involved, including ancestors of the Turks, such as the Xiongnu, possibly related to the Huns of late Roman history, and the Ji, the Mongolians or Shanbi, and the Tibetans or Di and Qiang. Most of these nomadic peoples, relatively few in number, had to some extent been Sinicized long before their ascents to power. Some of them, notably the Qiang and the Xiongnu, actually had been allowed to live in the frontier regions within the Great Wall since late Han times. The barbarian rulers thus set up semi-Sinicized states, in which the foreign elements constituted a military aristocracy and the nucleus of the armed forces. Since they lacked experience in administrative matters and since their own tribal institutions were not adapted to the complicated task of ruling a large agrarian society, they had to make use of traditional Chinese ways of government. In doing so, they faced the dilemma that has ever since confronted foreign rulers on Chinese soil: the tension that existed between the need to preserve their own ethnic identity and their position as Herrenvolk on the one hand, and on the other the practical necessity of using Chinese literati and members of prominent Chinese families in order to rule at all. In spite of various and sometimes highly interesting experiments, most of these short-lived empires did not survive this tension. Significantly, the only one that proved to have more lasting power and that was able to unify the whole of northern China, the Tuoba or Bei Northern Hui, 386 to 534 or 535, was largely Sinicized within a century. In the late 5th century, the court even forbade the use of the original Tuoba language, dress, customs, and surnames. This policy of conscious acculturation was further symbolized by the transfer of the Bei Wei capital from the northern frontier region to the ancient imperial residence of Luoyang. Thus, toward the end of the period of division, the north had become more homogeneous as the result of a long process of adaptation. The most important factor in this process may have been the rehabilitation of the Chinese agrarian economy under the Beiwei, stimulated by fiscal reform and redistribution of land. Circa 500 CE, the landed gentry again became the backbone of society, and the rulers' nomadic origin simply had to conform to their way of life. Another factor was the perceived intrinsic superiority of the Chinese upper-class culture. In order to play the role of the son of heaven, the leaders of the barbarian court had to adopt the complicated rules of Chinese ritual and etiquette. Likewise, in order to surround themselves with an aura of legitimacy, the foreign conquerors had to express themselves in terms of Chinese culture. In doing so, they invariably lost their own identity. History has constantly repeated itself. In this respect of 4th and 5th century, Jay and Tuoba were but the forerunners of the Qing or Manchu rulers in the 19th century. In the early 6th century, the Wei was divided between the Sinicized court and a faction of the nobility desperate to preserve its Tuoba identity. Soon after 520, the Wei Empire disintegrated into rival northeastern and northwestern successor states. Northern China again became a battlefield for several decades. The Bei or Northern Zhou 557 to 581, strategically based in the rich basin of the Wei River, reunified the North 577. 4 years later, Yang Zhan, or better known by this posthumous name, Wen Di, a general of mixed Chinese and barbarian descent but claiming to be a pure-blooded Chinese, usurped the throne and founded the Sui dynasty. In 589, having consolidated his regime, he crossed the Yangtze River and overthrew the last of the Chinese dynasties at Jiangkan. After almost 4 centuries of division and political decay, China was again united under one central government, which, in spite of its short duration, would lay the foundation of the Great Tang Empire. Intellectual and religious trends, Confucianism and philosophical Taoism. The social and political upheaval of the late 2nd and the 3rd century CE was accompanied by intense intellectual activity. During the Han period, Confucianism had been slowly adopted as an ideology and had gradually come to provide the officially accepted norms, morals, and ritual and social behavior regulating the relations between ruler and subject. By the beginning of the 3rd century, however, Confucianism had lost its prestige. It had obviously failed to save the empire from disintegration or to safeguard the privileges of the ruling elite. Disappointed members of the scholar official class started to look elsewhere. Thus, various all but forgotten schools of thought were revived in the 3rd century. Legalism, with its insistence of harsh measures intended to reestablish law and order, Mohism, and the ancient school of logicians or dialecticians, and above all, a renewed interest in Taoism and its earliest philosophers, Laozi and Zhuangzi. In general, this movement did not mean a return to ancient Taoist Quietism and consequently a rejection of Confucianism. With a breakdown of the elaborate scholastic doctrine that had formed the official Han ideology, Confucianism had been deprived of its metaphysical superstructure, and this vacuum was now filled by a whole set of philosophical ideas and speculations, largely of Taoist provenance. Within this movement, two trends came to dominate the intellectual life of the cultured minority. One of these was closely related to the practical affairs of government and stressed the importance of social duties, ritual, law, and the study of human characteristics. This mixture of Confucian and legalist notions was called Mingjiao, the doctrine of names. Names in ancient Confucian parlance designating the various social functions: father, ruler, subject, etc., that an individual could have in society. The other trend was marked by a profound interest in ontological and metaphysical problems, the quest for a permanent substratum called T substance behind the world of change called Yang function. It started from the assumption that all temporally and spatially limited phenomena, anything nameable, all movement, change, and diversity, in short, all being, is produced and sustained by one impersonal principle, which is unlimited, unnameable, unmoving, unchanging, and undiversified. This important movement, which found its scriptural support both in Taoist and drastically reinterpreted Confucian resources, was known as Xuan Sui, or dark learning. It came to reign supreme in cultural circles, especially at Jiangkan during the period of division, and represented the more abstract, unworldly, and idealistic tendency in early medieval Chinese thought. The proponents of Xuanzi undoubtedly still regarded themselves as true Confucians. To them, Confucius was not simply the great teacher who had fixed the rules of social behavior for all time, but was the enlightened sage who had inwardly recognized the ultimate reality but had kept silent about it in his worldly teachings, knowing that these mysteries could not be expressed in words. Hence, his doctrine was supposed to be an expedient, a mere set of ad hoc rules intended to answer the practical needs of the times. This concept of hidden saintliness and the expedient character of the canonical teachings came to play a very important role in upper-class Buddhism. Shanzu is sometimes referred to by the term Neo-Taoism, but this confuses the issue. It was both created by and intended for literati and scholar officials, not Taoist masters and hermits. The theories of such thinkers as Ji Kang 224 to 262, who with their quest for immortality and their extreme anti-ritualism were much nearer to the spirit of Taoism, hardly belonged to the sphere of Xuanzu, and the greatest Taoist author of this period, Ge Hong, circa 283 to 343, was clearly opposed to these mystic speculations. True Confucianism had thus lost much of its influence. In the north, the not yet Sinicized barbarian rulers were interested in Confucianism mainly as a system of court ritual. Ideologically, they were more attracted by the magical powers of Buddhist and Taoist masters. In the south of disillusioned aristocratic exiles, doomed by circumstances to lead a life of elegant inactivity, had little use for a doctrine that preached the duties of government and the regulations of human society as its highest goals. Although many families preserved Confucian learning and clung to Confucian mores, in this period of internal division and political weakness, Confucianism had hibernated. Soon after the Sui and reunited the empire, it would wake up again. Taoism, the suppression of the Yellow Turbans and other Taoist religious movements in 184 CE had left Taoism decapitated. With the elimination of its highest leadership, the movement had fallen apart into many small religious communities, each led by a local Taoist master or Taoishi, assisted by a council of wealthy Taoist laity. Taoism's role from the early medieval period provide a spiritual consolation and ritualized forms of communal activity, integrating function, potential source of subversive movements, disintegrating factor. Taoism has always been a huge complex of many different beliefs, cults, and practices. Most of these can be traced to Donghan times, and after the 3rd century, they were influenced increasingly by Buddhism. The basic ideal of Taoist religion, the attainment of bodily immortality in a kind of indestructible astral body, and the realization of the state of Shan, or Taoist, immortal, remained alive. Dietary control, gymnastics, good deeds, meditation, and visualization of the innumerable gods and spirits. The development of Taoism seems to have reached a new stage during the 4th century. An ancient school of esoteric learning already existed at that time in southern China. New priestly cults arose in the south. Their teaching were connected with a series of revelations, the first through Yangtze, which led the information first of the Shangqing sect and later to the rival Lingbao sect. By the end of the period of division, Taoism had its own canons and scriptural writings, much influenced by Buddhist models but forming a quite independent religious tradition. The other collective and more popular form of Taoism, practiced in the communities throughout the country, was characterized by communal ceremonies. Example, Zai, fasting, session, and Cho, banquets. The purpose of such meetings was to eliminate sins. The Taoist community as an organization and Taoishi who led it relied on two sources of income: the gifts made by devotee families at ceremonial gatherings, the regular heavenly tax or yearly contribution of 5 bushels of rice, which every family was expected to pay on the 7th day of the 7th month. The office of Dawishi was hereditary within one family. In the early centuries, Taoist priests usually married. 5th century onward, Taoist priests went to live in Taoist monasteries with their wives and children. 6th century, when Buddhism became paramount, some Taoist leaders introduced celibacy. The Taoist monasteries and clergy never developed great economic power. Buddhism. The Buddhist age of China began in the 4th century. Several factors contributed to the extraordinary expansion and absorption of the foreign religion in South and North Chinese. The absence of unified Confucian state. The popularity of Shanshu was a positive and powerful factor. The relative security and prosperity of monastic life. Process of tax evasion that consequently extended the manorial system. The monasteries had become an economic power of the first order. The monastic life attracted many members of the gentry as well. The monastery offered a hiding place to literati. Many large monasteries thereby became centers of learning and culture. Buddhist institutions offered a kind of internal democracy. Buddhism was patronized by most of the barbarian rulers in the north. The large-scale development of Chinese Buddhism started only after the barbarian invasions of the early 4th century. 3rd century, there are indications that Buddhism was still largely a religion of foreigners on Chinese soil. 4th century, at the southern Chinese court in Jiangkan, a clerical elite was forming of Chinese monks and propagators of a completely Sinicized Buddhism, strongly amalgamated with Xuanzhu. Their sophisticated creed was being spread among the southern gentry. This status was carried out until the 5th century, which was the peak of the Chinese Buddhism. In the north, the climax of Buddhist activity and imperial patronage occur under the Wei, especially after the beginning of their policy and conscious Sinicization. The Toba court and the great families vied with each other in building temples and granting land and money to the monasteries. The monumental cave temples at Yongang and Longmen are lasting proof of this large-scale imperial protection. Art and culture. Painting. During the 6th Dynasties period, people began to write about art and appreciate painting for its own beauty. Many illustrated Confucian moral, the six principles. C. He, a writer, art historian, and critic in 5th century China. Spirit resonance or vitality, bone method or the way of using the brush, correspondence to the object or the depicting of form, suitability to type or the application of color, division and planning or placing and arrangement, transmission by copying or the copying of models. Calligraphy. Wang Zi, the sage of calligraphy. Lan Tingsu, a famous work of calligraphy composed in the year 353 CE. Written in semi-cursive script, it is among the best-known pieces of calligraphy in Chinese history and is often copied. This work began as the preface to a seminal collection of Chinese nature poetry but developed a life of its own. The preface consists of 324 Chinese characters in 28 lines. Character Z appears 20 times but no two appearances look the same, a feature that constitutes calligraphic excellence. Celebrated work of literature flows rhythmically and gave rise to several Chinese idioms. Architecture. The Buddhism had spread with tremendous momentum throughout China during the 6th century. Chinese culture was adjusting and adapting its tradition to include Buddhism worship. It marked a deep influence on architecture. The distinct Chinese pagoda tower evolved during the 6th Dynasties period from the stupa, which came from Buddhist traditions of protecting sutras in ancient India. Songyo Pagoda, built in 523 CE, is the oldest extant pagoda in China, enduring primarily because it was constructed from brick instead of wood. Pottery or funerary models. The best surviving example of a monumental statuary from the Liang dynasty is the ensemble of the tomb of Xiao Shu, 475 to 518 CE, a brother of Emperor Wu, located in Qisha district east of Nanjing. Although mostly only ruins of brick and rump earth walls and towers from the 6 dynasties have survived, information on ancient Chinese architecture, especially wooden architecture, can be discerned from realistic clay models of buildings created as funerary items. Depicted miniature versions of 6 dynasties architecture were made to decorate the tops of sol vases, hanping, found in many tombs of that period. Jar's designs often incorporated animal and Buddhist figures. Advances in technology. Technology advanced significantly during the relatively short Three Kingdoms 220 to 280 CE period, including in the realm of architecture. Shu Chancellor Zhuge Liang invented the wooden ox, an early form of the wheelbarrow, and improved on the repeating crossbow. Wei mechanical engineer Ma Jun invented a hydraulic-powered mechanical puppet theater for Emperor Ming of Wei, square pallet chain pumps for irrigation of gardens in Luoyang, and the ingenious design of the south-pointing chariot, a non-magnetic directional compass operated by differential gears.